Right. Hello, everyone. All right. Thank you to the organization, first of all, for the chance to be with you here today. I will be discussing the Digital Omnibus and just proposing some of my thoughts on the possibility of this being an opportunity or a risk for open source. And spoiler, it's kind of a bit of both. Just to contextualize, I am not a lawyer, this is not legal analysis, but just my perspective as a practitioner. I am the head of policy and compliance at Element and also the DPO at the Matrix.org Foundation. So I have some experience of trying to implement EU policy in both the non-profit and the commercial perspectives of open source. So to give a brief introduction, if you're not familiar with the Digital Omnibus, it is a series of regulatory proposals that spans across various packages. I'm sure you're all familiar with the GDPR, and it also covers ePrivacy Directive, NIS2, and the EU Data Act. There is a separate omnibus which focuses on AI and the AI Act specifically, which I will not cover today. So this is focused on the first one. This was initially proposed in November 2025, but it is actually the second stage of the development of this proposal, following an initial call for evidence that happened in the spring and summer of last year. So right now we are in this phase of open consultation that has introduced the regulatory proposal. So the explicit aim here is to harmonize and simplify the requirements of these various regulations, which hopefully will reduce our administrative load and incentivize innovation. That is really the aim here. So my goal for today and for the time we have together is to discuss my perspective on these potential risks and opportunities, but to also encourage you all to engage with the consultation process for this proposal, as it touches on many of the core pieces of legislation that we all have to work with. So I think it's quite key that as an open source community we contribute. And it is still open until the 11th of March, unlike the open source digital ecosystems, which ends on Tuesday. So you have some time if you haven't started looking at it yet. So what are the key changes that we're expecting to see from this proposal? First one is a simplified approach to cookies. I think we've all been waiting for a long time for an update on the ePrivacy Directive, which has promised the simplification for a while, and it hopes to address consent fatigue. There's a big focus on improving access to data and including access to for AI, but again, I won't focus as much on that side of things. There's the hope for an alignment and standardization of key definitions and concepts across regulations. And if you've ever had to look at all of these separately, it can be tricky to have a glossary in your mind of all of these definitions and what they mean and how they can apply to you. There's also the proposal for an integrated reporting system, which would cover incident reporting and personal breach reporting, which should hopefully harmonize all of the requirements from the GDPR to the future CRA requirements. There's also a proposal to relax some of the timeline requirements around the GDPR. And there's some other changes which are really associated with the GDPR, such as reducing some of the transparency requirements on controllers, expanding legitimate interests to include scientific research and, again, AI development, and to standardize the DPIA approach. This is not an extensive list. The proposal is nearly 200 pages long. So these are some of the key points from my perspective that could impact our community. So now going to opportunities. As someone that says it depends for a living, having less legal complexity will be really useful. Having more clarity would definitely give us more bandwidth and give us more capacity to innovate, to be creative on how we approach these things. So there's definitely a big opportunity here for us to have clarity and for us to be able to focus on what's really important as opposed to spending our time figuring out how all of these things work together. And of course, we, as an open source community and open source projects in general, we could really benefit from these streamlined requirements. Resourcing is not something that we have in abundance, and it can be really tricky to make sense of all of this at times. So if we can reduce our admin load on trying to make sense of all of these things, hopefully we will reduce costs and being able to focus our efforts and our funding into development and creativity and innovation. Then we have the single point of entry for incidents and for reporting of breaches, which from my perspective could be the most impactful operational change from this proposal. I believe that in the latest data stock of this, there are about 350 breaches reported every single week to the various supervisory authorities. The supervisory authorities have to also grapple with all of these different requirements and timelines. So if we do have a single point of entry that we can focus on, report on, we can spend our time actually trying to prevent incidents, getting to the bottom line and the root cause of these incidents, and make them stop, essentially, or prevent them as much as possible, instead of having to navigate different reporting requirements, different timelines, and then contractual requirements on top of that. Another opportunity that I've not managed to fit in here is this approach to standard DPIAs, data protection impact assessments. So I think there's many times this idea that we have to reinvent the wheel and be working in isolation in these cases, but actually a lot of us are facing the same problems and we're facing the same issues, especially when we're trying to innovate. So a lot of the risks that we're considering and a lot of the things that we are assessing are the same. So this idea that we can publish DPIAs and that supervisory authorities will have standard approaches and standard risks to DPIAs would be a very welcome opportunity. But now we move on to risks, which really, from my perspective, is one big risk, and it is touching the key definition of personal data in the GDPR. So the current definition of personal data, in very, very basic terms, is personal data is something that could be used to identify an individual directly or indirectly. The current proposal adds about 2 paragraphs to this definition, uses the word entity about 7 times, and it can introduce a lot of nuance. And again, nuance is not always the best thing when we're trying to be transparent and when we're trying to make sure that people's rights are protected. So from my perspective, when we start touching this key definition and when we start introducing nuance, we will have more complexity, we will have more confusion, not clarity and simplification. There is really the risk of diluting some of our very hard-earned protections. And also, we've all been talking this whole week about digital sovereignty, and one of the biggest strengths and advantages we've had in Europe is our strong protection and our really core focus on personal data protections. So if we need open source to deliver digital sovereignty, and if we need to focus on our European stance on these things, we really should not be touching a core principle of a lot of these regulations. Again, when we start adding nuance and we start adding the perspective that as a controller I can decide that something is personal data, it won't be for someone else, it will just add a lot of complexity, a need for discussion that not all of us will have the time for. And it just opens the possibility for abuses of this definition. So that would be a main part of my response to this consultation, would be really encouraging the lawmakers to reconsider touching the definitions of the GDPR and instead bringing up the other definitions in the other legislations to this core principle. And really, when we talk about open source, we talk about trust, and this trust is earned through transparency. And if we start bringing in complexity and nuance, I believe that it will make people a lot less willing to share their perspective and to be transparent. So that is really a risk that I'm really not willing to take. Also, thank you, nearly there. This seems to be really, really focused on a very specific case, but actually when you look through the past evidence for this digital omnibus, it has actually not been something that has been asked for by most of the participants. What we really need is to simplify the workload when it comes to paperwork, not to discuss what is personal data or not. I think we're all in agreement on what needs to be protected at this point. So, to conclude, yes, everything is getting more complicated. We have more and more pieces of regulations coming out every single day, and our digital ecosystems are getting more and more complex. We've been talking a lot about the need to address this, the need to bring sovereignty back, but we also need to consider the strain that this puts and the big pressure that it puts on open source projects. So if there's a way to simplify our lives and making sure that we can focus on the real problems, that is very welcome. But this simplification should not come at the cost of personal data and those protections that took a long time to be embedded into law. So I would really encourage you to make the effort to take the time to engage with this process, to highlight any of the risks that I might have not considered, and to just support each other and discuss with your colleagues what other risks the lawmakers might not have considered when what we need to do to prevent this from happening. Thank you very much for your time.